Okay, here we go, ladies and gentlemen. John King's over there. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Peter.
And the fabulous Bob Seiden-Schwartz.
Good morning, gentlemen. Before we get started, I'd just like to make an announcement. This will be my last show. I've been given a speaking gig. I will be receiving $250,000 from the Republic of Corruption in Central Russia. I have not just been given 3 suites, but the entire Hotel 6.
Wow.
Yeah, and a Boeing 757. So, guys, I'll see you.
Are you doing this through the Clinton Foundation?
Through the foundation.
Nice.
Thank you very much. So
I like that.
I'll let you know how I
like
figured
your
this
connections,
out. Yeah.
Bob.
That's
Hook me
very
up.
good. So, are you going to adopt us? Or
Oh, no, you're coming with me.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah,
We've got our own radio show.
Someone's got to carry the ice
Somebody's
water
gotta-
for it.
you need some lackeys.
We
to
need
help.
some lackeys. So, Jeff, we're just pivoting off of a news story that was this morning. So just having a little bit of fun before we get started. But I'd like to welcome Geoffrey Skiles to Missoula, Montana.
All right. Now, Jeff, if you don't mind, I'm going to embarrass the heck out of you by reading your bio here, okay? So,
That's quite all right.
Here we go. Jeff Skiles, over 25 years of industry experience. Mr. Skiles is widely known for his insights on the energy sector and its related commercial and environmental issues, along with his expertise in strategic and scenario planning. Since 2002, he has served as a consultant advisor, helping organizations and executives address systems-level policy. Along with his extensive writing on the industry, this work leverages his informed but independent perspective and objective assessment of current and emerging energy technologies and networks and the geopolitical, economic, security, and sustainability factors that drive them. His views on energy have been quoted frequently by the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and Washington Post, and his internationally recognized blog on the energy industry was named one of the top 50 eco-blogs by the Times of London. So, Jeff, welcome. You're there in not far from Washington, D.C. We welcome you to Missoula.
Thanks a lot.
So, Jeff, you and myself have had prior to the show several conversations in terms of preparing for this. And I'd run across an article, The Golden Age of Natural Gas. And in that article, it was touting, what was coming and the advantages and the opportunities. And then all of a sudden, things change in terms of pricing, competition. So what I had asked you to do in terms of speaking to the audience today is give your kind of state of the union as you're speaking to our group here to talk about what has happened and where we are today. So give us your best insight and understanding of kind of the state of the union of energy as it stands right now.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I've been in the energy industry for a long time, and this is far and away the most interesting and exciting period that I've experienced. If you think about what's going on, it's really extraordinary, particularly because, the changes that have occurred have really taken us out of this era of scarcity that we've lived with in energy for so long, going back to the 1970s, into what appears to be a dawning era of energy abundance. And I think that's going to change a number of things, not just in energy. It's going to change really the way that we live our lives going forward. But this is really being driven by the fact that there's not one, but 2 major energy revolutions currently underway in the world. It's unusual for this to happen. We've seen other periods where one big thing was happening, but we've really got 2 big things happening right now. One of them is the shale revolution, and I think that's something that's probably very familiar to your audience there in Montana. Everything that's going on next door in North Dakota with the Bakken shale, but this is happening on an enormous scale across the U.S., and it's starting to happen now in other places around the world. We can talk later about why it happened here first and why it's still a lot more robust here than it is in some other places, but it's starting to become a global phenomenon, and it is certainly having global effects. The other revolution is the renewable energy revolution, and this is also a very dramatic thing. It's having more of an impact in the way that we produce and use electricity than for transportation fuels and things like that, but it's very significant. But these 2 revolutions are also quite different from each other. The technologies that are driving them are different. The factors that really push them along are very different. The shale revolution has been largely driven by market forces. We had high energy prices that gave people the incentive to go out and take entrepreneurial risk and employ technology that was there, but it hadn't really been combined in quite that way. And then on the renewable side, we've had a lot of investment in technology over the years, but the deployment of that technology is still, even though the cost of these things have come down a lot, the deployment of that technology is still very much a function of government policy.
I'm curious. I'm
subsidies.
curious when you think that renewable energy revolution began, because I never saw a revolution as much as a slow crawl.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, you can go back and you can look at the first wind farms in the late 1970s, early 1980s. They were small. There weren't many of them, and they were really not very efficient. And there's been significant improvements in the efficiency of those and in the scale of those, and they're now really all over the place, most of the country except for the southeast. Solar power was discovered, I guess the principles go back more than 100 years. The photovoltaic cell, I believe, was discovered by Bell Labs, I think 1940s, 1950s, something like that. So you're right. I mean, all of these things have roots that go back a ways, but, that's pretty typical of technology revolutions. I mean, we tend to think of them more from the time that they hit our awareness. But if you go back and you look at, when did these things really start in the lab, it takes 10 or 15 years at least to get something out of the laboratory and out where, it's starting to affect your life.
But it seemed like it was different with shale. Like overnight, like there was a boom industry in the inland Northwest in the United States and Canada.
Shale goes back, George Mitchell, 1950s.
Right, the preliminary ability to do it.
And in fact, they've been fracking for the last several decades. So fracking...
Over 1 million oil and gas wells have been fracked in the United States since the late 1940s, I believe. I think the first one was somewhere in Texas.
Right.
But those were conventional reservoirs, typically, that were being hydraulically fractured. That's the real term that's underneath, what we call fracking, as well as horizontal drilling, which is a relatively new technology. Horizontal drilling has not been around nearly as long. And what helped this thing to take off, first of all, there was actually a lot of R&D, and a lot of that R&D was sponsored by the government going back to the 1970s, to the first energy crisis in the 1970s. But then you had people like George Mitchell, who had the entrepreneurial vision to say, wait a minute, we've known about these resources for a long time. Some of these shale deposits, were discovered 100 years ago or more. But we didn't have the technology to produce them economically in quantities that made sense. So people like Mitchell went into the Barnett Shale in Texas near Dallas, Fort Worth, and they figured out the recipe. They figured out how to use this technology in a way that enabled the stuff to be produced commercially. So what did that take? What it really took was the right combination of factors. It took relatively high prices. Think about what the price of natural gas was in the early years of the previous decade, the early 2000s. It had gotten to pretty high levels because conventional U.S. production was really falling off a cliff, especially in the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So you had, a supportive price environment. You had the technology that was available. You had companies that had the capability to go out and drill these wells for the companies that had the money to invest in them. Crucially, you had private ownership of the land under which these deposits were found. So you had the ability to go in, arrange to lease, to get the rights to drill on this land. You had the technology, you had the money, you had a legal environment where you could do these contracts and know that they would stay in place. So it took everything coming into place, and then it just started to ramp up like crazy. You're right.
Okay. Jeff, we're up against a break, and we have a caller who wants to visit with you, so we're going to come right back after this quick timeout. About every 10 minutes, we'll have a break like this. 721-1290. We have 2 lines open. You want to visit with Jeff Stiles.
And we have a caller who wants to talk about Coal Strip, which is a coal plant here in Montana.
We'll be right back. Yeah, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. Jeff Stiles joining us on the telephone. He's with us just outside of Washington, D.C. And let's get Larry on the line. He's been waiting very patiently. So, okay, push the right button. Larry, you're on with Mr. Stiles. Go ahead, sir.
Good morning. Jeff, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Montana's situation, but we have Colstrip, which is our major coal producer, and that two of the plants are owned by utilities that are, I think, located out of state. And the state of Washington said, we're going to pursue renewables. And so basically the utilities that own those two plants are saying we're going to shut those down. And I wondered if technology is available to repurpose those plants to clean coal technologies where we could still use the resource, maintain the employment by re-outfitting those things, and possibly have the state of Montana use their coal trust fund to purchase those plants to where they could be back under Montana control rather than out-of-state control.
Hey, Larry. Thanks for the call. So, Jeff, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm not familiar with the specific plants in question. However, you really have to look at what's driving this shift. So the people that are saying that they don't want to use coal anymore, they want to use renewables, most of the time their focus is on what's called greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide and other gases that are emitted when you burn fossil fuels. And it turns out that burning coal actually produces a lot more of those gases than burning, say, natural gas or even burning oil. So coal-fired power plants are the number one target for the folks that are mainly concerned with greenhouse gas emissions, so the CO2 that comes out of these power plants. It's much easier to clean up the smokestacks of coal-fired power plants to eliminate things like the particulate pollution, the SOx and NOx, as they're called, the oxides of sulfur and nitrogen that cause smog, things like that. You can do that scrubbing relatively cost-effectively. You still have to look at the economics of every individual power plant and the market that it's in. But removing carbon dioxide from the smokestack of a power plant, it's something called carbon capture and sequestration, CCS is what they refer to it. This is a pretty complicated and expensive technology. It's hard to retrofit onto an existing plant. They're building brand new coal-fired power plants. There's a couple of them under construction, one in Mississippi. They're complicated, and so because the first ones are sort of unique, it's costing a lot of money to build them, billions of dollars. It's taking longer than expected to build them. So there's a lot of concern about those issues. So yeah, there's a technological solution that's available, but it hasn't been demonstrated in power plants really at the scale that we're talking about. So far, it's been used in other places for other kinds of extraction, and it's expensive. So you'd really have to look at the economics of this, and that's probably as deep as we can go into that on this program.
Where do they put the CO2? They shove it underground? They put it in soda bottles, or what?
You laugh about soda bottles. When I years ago, I was in the trading side of the oil business, and one of the refineries that I was looking after actually produced a pure stream of carbon dioxide, and yeah, that's where we sold it. We sold it to people that put it into carbonated beverages and used it for dry ice. But that's not what we're talking about now, because the goal for folks is to keep that stuff out of the atmosphere completely. So, you look at basically injecting it into the ground. One of the opportunities that people see is to take the carbon dioxide that can be removed from the exhaust gas of a power plant, concentrating it, and putting it into oil and gas reservoirs to actually increase the production. So the carbon dioxide stays in the ground, and you get more oil out of it.
Kinder Morgan uses that for a significant part of its oil extraction. Several other companies do. use CO2 for that purpose.
And
Yeah,
with
now
that,
you have to be
with,
careful because a lot of the CO2 that's being used today for that kind of, it's called enhanced oil recovery, a lot of that CO2 is actually coming out of the ground in wells.
Yeah.
So people are drilling into formations that actually have naturally occurring carbon dioxide in the ground, and they're producing that carbon dioxide to put into those wells. So this would be different. This would be taking carbon dioxide out of what a power plant would otherwise put into the atmosphere. And you take that and you put that into the oil formation. Other places you could just put it into a saline reservoir deep underground. There's different ways that you can do this. There's technologies where you liquefy it and you could even put it on the sea bottom. I don't think that's been demonstrated yet. But,
okay, we're up against a break, Jeff. Hang on just a second. We also have Rena, who's waiting to visit with you after this quick timeout. We'll be right back. A very fascinating conversation. Love to have you get in on it. 721-1290 or on our Facebook page. Hey, this Talk Back. The Montana World Affairs Council on the radio continues. Bob Seidenschwartz, John King, Peter Christian joining us on the phone, Jeff Stiles, and Rena has been waiting very patiently on the phone. Hi, Rena. What's on your mind?
Oh, good morning. I wanted to input on the topic of wind energy being a revolution. The way it's concepted and the way it's been enacted, the federal government has paid tax credits to organizations involved in wind energy projects, and those tax credits are basically a check written from the American taxpayers' funds to the financiers and other organizations. And these turbines are often manufactured overseas in China and have a great deal of pollution and other issues involved with their manufacture. And I don't know if our guest has driven down the gorge and looked at the skyline, and I just can't imagine any reasonable American thinking that that is an improvement. It's a terrible eyesore.
You're talking about the Columbia Gorge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, we're running short of time. I'm going to let him answer that question. Thanks, Rena. So go ahead, Jeff. We got about a minute and a half.
Rena, thank you. You've raised a lot of really important points there. Making a shift to wind power and renewables like that, this is not just about, the electricity comes from a different place. This is a completely different way and a much more intrusive way of producing energy, because basically we go from energy that's produced, over there somewhere out of sight, out of mind, to energy that's going to be produced all around us. And you just will not be able to get away from seeing, where this stuff is being produced, whether it's, a wind farm, in an area that you used to enjoy the scenic vistas, whether it's solar panels on the roofs of every building in sight, or out in the middle of a big field. It's bringing energy much closer to us, and there's some real mixed blessings with that. It may be cleaner in some respects. You pointed out that some of the manufacturing processes that are used in China and other places where some of these products come from are not so great, and that's something that needs to be explored further to understand what's the whole life cycle of these things. Yeah, they don't emit any greenhouse gases when they're being operated, but what sort of pollution accompanies the production of these things, and that just needs to be factored in. That's true of the batteries for some of the new electric vehicles as well.
All right. And with that, Jeff, I'm so sorry. We got to jump in and take a quick break, but we have a whole other hour to discuss this, and this is something that affects absolutely everyone listening to this show, whether you listen to it now or later. Of course, we have our Facebook comments as well. We have 3 lines open at 721-1290. Our guest is Jeff Stiles. We're talking about energy worldwide, and we'll be right back in just a moment. Okay, we are back, and we've got all sorts of folks that want to visit with Jeff Stiles. We're talking about energy development, not just domestically, but worldwide. So you have a Facebook comment, Jeff.
Yeah, this is we were talking about fracking and technology and the growth of these two revolutions during the first half hour, and Chad says he worked in North Dakota for a couple of years recently and was amazed at how technology was integrated into all facets of oil production. On well pads that are being fracked, there can be 12 pump trucks, each 50 feet long, that are controlled wirelessly from a data van When it's time to pump the sand and fluid to open up the formation, a couple of guys in the van press a few buttons, the truck pressures up, and they start fracking.
It's called the octopus. That's new, sending out 8 to 10 different arms to be able to extract even more oil, thereby making it more efficient from a cost standpoint for the energy company.
Now, we don't have television, but you should know that Bob did demonstrate octopus arms during that explanation.
But I must say, but that is also, there's good news and bad news. The good news is, hey, it's technologically cool. Bad news is it costs jobs, does it not?
Yeah.
You have to use fewer people.
That's true.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, we've gotten into a strange mindset around energy, and I think it happened during the recovery from the Great Recession and the financial crisis and all that. Suddenly everybody was talking about, did this thing add jobs? Did that thing add jobs? You had this weird metric out there, number of jobs created or saved, right? How many times did we hear that? And, the thing that's easy to forget, and obviously if it's your job that's lost, it's a huge problem. And I've been through that myself. But energy is just by its nature, it's what's called capital intensive. It means that, what really pushes the needle on energy is the amount of money you invest. So if you're looking to create a bunch of jobs, energy projects are not necessarily where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck on job creation. In fact, if you see somebody quoting that some energy technology or project or whatever is creating a huge number of jobs, you have to really carefully look at the numbers and see how inefficient this project might be. Because when there's lots and lots of people involved, it's probably not terribly efficient.
Wow.
You look at the number of people that are involved in, putting solar panels on roofs. Well, it's great if you're a solar panel installer, but if you're looking at it from the total perspective of how much energy can we add in the country, maybe that's not what you should really be looking at as a job creation mechanism. Energy, the role that energy plays in the economy, energy is crucial for everything. Energy is a building block. It's a cornerstone, right? So the way I always look at it is, if you invest in energy, the jobs show up in the places where energy is used.
Such as manufacturing, chemical production, many of the businesses that need and benefit from lower prices, that's what drives many of the jobs.
Okay, when you say this, though, there's right now, I'm sorry. There's right now governors.
The biggest energy sector that you can have to employ the most people that you can. You want the most efficient energy sector that you can have, so you get the biggest bang in the rest of the economy, where the action is.
In lots of areas of the West, for example, Montana, we have gubernatorial races going on. We have legislators arguing that in their states, they can replace the loss of jobs from the coal industry with green jobs. That this is a job gainer. Is that a myth?
It's hard to say. I mean, you look at some of the stats on green jobs, and I don't want to take anything away from people that are working in plants producing solar panels or wind turbine blades or things like that. I mean, this is all great stuff, and we need this. But when you have people tallying up green jobs, and they count the bus driver of a bus that happens to be a hybrid as a green job, I think we're fooling ourselves a little bit. So you really have to look carefully at what exactly are these green jobs that are being created, where are they being created, what do they pay relative to the jobs that are being destroyed, and that sort of thing.
So you would say it is a myth? At first you said it was hard to say, then you said it's being disingenuous almost. So it sounds to me like you're pretty sure that it isn't going to math or calculate out.
It depends on what the green job is, because not all green jobs are created equal, just like not all other jobs are created equal. You can have somebody, making $100,000 a year in a solar cell factory. You can have somebody making $30,000 a year driving a bus someplace, and that happens to count as a green job, or driving a recycling truck, and that's a green job.
Okay,
right?
tell you what, I just want to say we have tons of callers. As a matter of fact, you are now officially a rock star. All of our lines are full.
Congratulations.
So let's go ahead and get Catherine on, and then as soon as Catherine asks her questions, plural. Then we're going to take a break and let you answer them because we're coming up against a break. Catherine, please go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to ask this gentleman about nuclear energy. New reactor operating license has just been issued, first time in 20 years, to the TVA. That's for a Spring Valley, Tennessee nuclear reactor that's been mothballed since I think the 80s, mid 80s, and it's been in development limbo for 40 years. Does this indicate a possible turnaround in U.S. government policy for nuclear power? The second question related to that is, what is the status, if any, on development in the United States of thorium reactors or molten salt reactors?
Okay, we're going to answer those questions when we come back from our break, so stay with us. Also, Boyd and Marilyn are waiting to visit with you as well, and I'm sure we have Facebook comments too, so we'll be right back. Hey, we are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Jeff Stiles joining us just outside of Washington, D.C. Catherine asked a couple of pretty good questions about nuclear power. We had an Osgood File program on our show this morning that talked about the mothballing of the last nuclear plant in California. Mm-hmm. So where is this headed? And can you address those two questions, please?
You know, this is something that has changed pretty significantly over the last several years. And, people used to talk 3 or 4 years ago about the nuclear renaissance. There's, I guess, 4 or 5 reactors that are under construction, mainly in the southeast, places like South Carolina. But we also have suddenly seen a number of nuclear power plants around the country that are either being shut down currently or that are planned to be shut down, like the Diablo Canyon plant in California that you just mentioned. Some of them because the economics don't work anymore, and we can talk about why, and it has something to do with both the shale revolution and the renewables revolution. But in California, it's part of a bigger shift. They're trying to change their entire energy economy and make everything rely on renewables. They've taken that further than any place else in the U.S. They're following the German model, and they're trying to push nuclear out. I would argue that, if your main concern is the environment, it's a mistake to shut down a nuclear power plant thinking that you're going to replace that electricity with electricity from renewables. What you want the renewables to do is to replace electricity from other sources that emit more. I mean, this is a giant source of low-emission energy that they're going to shut down, and they can't replace that easily.
Jeff, talk about scalability here, because this is an important concept I want the audience to understand when you're talking about nuclear energy.
Yeah, let's think about this, and it really has to do with how quickly we can make this transition to low-carbon energy, as people talk about. So renewables are growing rapidly. Renewables are becoming an important source of energy. But last year, 2015, wind and solar power together supplied 2.5% of the energy that we used in the U.S. Now, not just electricity, that's all energy, okay? At the same time, energy from shale, so shale gas and the oil from shale formation, sometimes people call it tight oil, that was 25% of the energy that the U.S. used last year, so total energy. So there's a scale of 10 difference there. If you look at how much energy was added from these different sources, so last year in the U.S., the energy that we added from shale gas, well, from natural gas in general, all the increment is shale gas, and from shale oil, compared to the energy we added from wind and solar power, was about 40 times more gas and oil than wind and solar. So these revolutions are still operating at very different scales. That won't always be true. 10 years from now it might look a little bit different, but anybody that's telling you today that we are within 5 to 10 years of being able to do away with all fossil fuels has not done the math.
Catherine also asked about thorium and liquid salt reactors.
Yeah, and I'll be
or
honest,
molten salt reactors, sorry.
I know that there is a small and very enthusiastic group of folks out there who are pushing the idea of a thorium reactor because it's based on a radioactive element that's much easier to deal with than uranium. The life cycle of thorium doesn't create the possibility of turning it into nuclear weapons, as I understand it. But as I understand it, the only place in the world where one of these things is actually in the works to be built is in China. I'm not aware of any thorium reactor that's planned to be built in the U.S. that's moved anywhere down the planning process. I mean, you have to get a permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the technology itself. You also need a permit for the location that you're going to do this. I don't think any of this is in the works. But I'm not an expert on this, but that's kind of the state of the technology that I'm aware of. But she also talked about TVA. TVA has the good news to be that they've started up the first new nuclear power plant in the U.S., I believe in 25 years, something like that, at Watts Bar. It's an unusual situation. The plant was started back in the 1980s and construction was stopped, and then it was restarted a few years ago, and it's actually coming online right now. I'd be more enthusiastic about that if we weren't in the process of shutting down all these other nuclear facilities. I think it's going to be very hard even to maintain the number of nuclear power plants that we have today, which produce about 20% of the electricity we use in the U.S. without any emissions.
Gotcha.
So it's
right.
a big issue.
Okay, Jeff, we got another caller on the line. Let's get Boyd. Boyd, you're on with Jeff Stiles. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. One of my major irritants with the people that push for solar and wind generation of electricity is they don't seem to realize that we can't store it. And with electricity, you have to be able to generate to meet the demand when it is needed. And, typical scenario in Montana in January, we have a Arctic cold pressure outbreak, and it's 30 to 40 below at night and 0 during the day, and not a puff of wind. So wind turbines aren't going to generate electricity. At night, the sun doesn't shine. You have to have electricity from some other source, and I don't see any way to get around that other than fossil fuels. Anyhow, that's my comment.
Okay, thanks, Boyd. So, Jeff?
So the word that you're going to hear from people, the big new trend, it used to be renewables. Now everybody is talking about storage. Storage is the big issue. And we're starting to see the beginnings of people installing storage on the grid and off-grid to be able to do what your caller was describing, to be able to store the energy from wind when it is producing or solar when it is producing, to be able to use it when you actually need it. The problem with that is it's still very expensive. There's places where we have pumped storage. That's an older technology that it's kind of a form of hydroelectricity. But for the new battery-type technology, it's still expensive. For instance, if you have about $10,000 to spare, Mr. Musk, the owner of Tesla, and or the chairman of Tesla and main shareholder, he will sell you a Powerwall, which is a battery unit that uses the same batteries that go into his Tesla car, and it'll store electricity from the solar panels on your roof or even from the grid, so that if your power goes out, you can use it then. But again, it's very, very expensive. And what the grid companies are finding, that they're finding a use for storage, not to store large amounts of energy, this week to use next week. They're finding that there's a value to the grid to being able to store energy for a few minutes or a few hours to dampen out some of the fluctuations. Because, solar and wind, they don't just fluctuate week to week. They can fluctuate minute to minute. If a cloud goes over your solar panel, it's not producing as much electricity. The wind goes up and down during the course of the day. So storage is a big issue, but your caller's right. Today, the only viable backup for these very unreliable sources of electricity is from fossil fuels. This is one of the reasons that you see so many natural gas power plants going in, because the new gas plants, they can ramp up and down very quickly to be able to mesh with wind coming in and going out, with the sun, going up and going down, and the way that demand changes during the course of the day.
Okay, now, Jeff, with that we got to take a break right now. So hang on. We also have Marilyn and Mark. We have Facebook comments. Bob has got his hand up.
We fluctuate every 10 minutes. You can expect it.
There's no fluctuation at all. It's steady as
I'm full. My storage is full.
Steady as a nuclear reactor. Well, we're going to be right back. Okay, we're rocking right along here on Talk Back, and it's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio, headed in 4,000 different directions, which is kind of the way it goes. And, Jeff, we really appreciate your patience. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, this is a direction we were in earlier. It was about clean coal and sequestration, et cetera. And it's from Pete. He says, if the same types of tax credits and low-interest loans that were given to the wind industry that we discussed earlier or the other renewable industries were given to the coal industry to make clean coal, would that make it competitive?
You know, I'd love to be able to say yes. And in theory, it might. But unfortunately, we also have the example of something called Future Gen. You can go and Google on Future Gen, and what you will see is a sad story about the federal government directing a whole lot of money, billions of tax dollars, into a project to build a coal-fired power plant that captures and sequesters its carbon dioxide and all the rest of that. And that project was, you know, from where I stood, it seemed to be mismanaged and confused, and it morphed a couple of times. They were going to build one big plant, and then they were going to build a bunch of little plants, and it never really decided what it was going to be when it grew up. And unfortunately, you know, throwing tax dollars at problems does not always solve them.
Sure. It's kind of like winning the lottery. They got all this money, they spend it, they're busted in 4 years.
Yeah. The flip side of that is that, you know, without some sort of way, think about this as a business prospect, right? So you've got a power plant today that's producing X amount of electricity, okay? Now you're going to bolt on a new piece of equipment. That piece of equipment's going to cost you, let's just say it's $1 billion. It's going to reduce the output of your power plant by 25% because it takes lots of energy to capture this carbon dioxide out of the flue gas, concentrate it, and then compress it and pipe it away to where it can be stuffed into the earth, right? So you've invested money, and you've reduced the output of your plant. So where are the economics of this? The only way that the economics make sense is if somebody closes that circle by paying you money either for the CO2 that you're capturing or paying you more money for the electricity that you're producing because it's green now, right? So that's what you need, is you need that piece to close the circle for carbon capture and sequestration. Otherwise, you know, it's basically a drag on a power plant. And we don't yet have the mechanism to do that I'm aware of.
And you have natural gas, which in many respects can replace coal-fired electric generation, which it has to a large degree. And we have an abundance of natural gas as a bridge, as some like to say. Correct, Jeff?
Some of us have more abundance than others.
Well, tell you what, Jeff, let's get another call on real quick because folks have been holding quite a while. Marilyn, thanks for your patience. You are on with Jeff. Go ahead.
Good morning. Okay, talking about major irritants, one of mine is how they say that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. It's not a pollutant. It's a byproduct of photosynthesis, and it makes up a minuscule fraction of greenhouse gases, water vapor, the most significant element. So can you address that? The propaganda of carbon dioxide being a pollutant just really irritates me, and aren't the fanatics going to try to stop natural gas development also?
Okay, thanks, Marilyn. So what do you think, Jeff?
So let me take the last part of that first, because you're absolutely right that natural gas is being targeted in the same way that coal has been targeted. You have lots of groups out there that are looking at gas and saying that the goal is to keep gas in the ground, not just coal in the ground, and that sort of thing for exactly the reasons that you described. Now, let's go back to the first part of the question, and I've got to tell you that this is an irritant to me. So I'm a chemical engineer, and from the way that I look at this stuff and the way that I was trained to look at this stuff, carbon dioxide, it doesn't fall neatly into the category of a pollutant. You look at pollutants like sulfur dioxide. If you tried to breathe, air that had sulfur dioxide in it, you would be coughing and choking, from the get-go. So CO2 is not a classic pollutant, and I think this is the unfortunate consequence of asking 9 lawyers to decide whether or not it was. And they did. But, look at it from a different perspective. If you take the word pollutant away, but think about this. So too much of anything can be a problem, right? You need water to live. You drink water, you cook with water, you bathe with water. All of these things are good. But when there's too much water, when you've got a wall of water coming down the riverbed towards you, and it's about to drown you, there can be too much of a good thing. And I think folks would argue that whether you call it a pollutant or not, the CO2 that we're emitting from burning fossil fuels is adding significantly CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. The computer models tell us that, it's going to produce a significant increase in the global temperature over time. There's uncertainties around all of this. We could spend the rest of the program talking about those. But I do think that calling it a pollutant wasn't helpful. And I think it wasn't helpful for the following reason. We're used to treating pollutants in a certain way. If you have smog-producing gases coming out of the tailpipe of a car, well, you want to clean it up right there, right? You don't want them leaving that tailpipe. But CO2 isn't like that. I mean, you don't have to tackle it at the tailpipe. You don't have to tackle it coming out of the smokestack. You can do all sorts of things to reduce CO2 in other ways. So reducing a ton of CO2 in Boston is exactly the same as reducing a ton of CO2 in Beijing in terms of how it affects the global atmosphere. So there's lots more ways to address it if you don't think about it as a classic pollutant like the things that we've been dealing with for the last 30 or 40 years. So I think that was unhelpful on the part of the Supreme Court.
Okay, we're up against a break, and when we come back, Mark, we're going to get your call on. We have 2 lines open, talking with Jeff Stiles. We're learning a lot. I hope you're all taking notes, because there will be a test at the end. So we're coming right back after this. Oh, yeah. 721-1290 is the number. John King, Bob Seidenschwartz. I have no idea what the joke is, but it must have been good.
John was doing powerlifting moves, and
I like
very
it.
impressed.
All right, let's Jeff Stiles joining us just outside Washington, D.C. We're talking about energy, and Mark has been saving a lot of energy waiting to share his comment. Mark, what's on your mind?
Hello, Jeff. I got a unique solution to a problem about finding a way to get clean coal through research and development, and that is lower the price of coal, because China's been ripping us off on our technologies, wait for us to develop it, and then they use it. So we lower the price of coal. That way they'll have to increase their research and development, and then we can rip it off from them when they develop it.
All right, Mark, thanks for the call. So, Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I think we're in the process of lowering the price of coal,
Yes.
but it's happening because we're using a lot more gas and other things.
Yeah, there's been several major bankruptcies of coal companies this year. So, talk about economic impact. These guys, they don't have a job now as a result of several of the bankruptcies that have taken place.
This discussion has brought, it kind of came up earlier, too. We're talking basically about free market principles and their influence on development. And earlier we were talking about investment in clean coal, and before that we had talked about investment in solar power and wind power. And I guess my question for you is this. We've been investing and subsidizing wind powers for over 30 years. Do you think that it's actually potentially held us back because it hasn't forced jumps in thinking or outside-the-box thinking in that particular industry?
I do. And I think when you look at the magnitude of the subsidies that wind power gets today, and you hear a lot of talk about, this technology or that technology is close to being commercial without subsidies. Wind is constantly talking about that. And yet we keep renewing the wind production tax credit.
They're just blowing hot air, I think.
If you look at how much that is, basically it's about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you compare that to the price of natural gas today, on an equivalent basis, it's about the same as the price of natural gas today. So what we're basically encouraging folks to do is to build wind farms in places that maybe don't have as good wind resources. What you have happening in places like Texas, where there's a lot of wind farms that have already been installed, the fact that people are getting a 2 cent per kilowatt hour tax credit actually enables them to sell power to the grid at zero or negative prices. Now, I don't know how another power plant competes when their competitor is selling power to the grid at zero or negative. This is one of the reasons that we're seeing some of these nuclear power plants that are not economical anymore to keep running, even though they were built 30 years ago. They're fully depreciated. Their costs of operation are relatively low, but competing with zero is hard.
Jeff, I have a question about thinking along these lines. Talk to us about energy density and research and development in terms of what that actually is, and if we're putting more money into research and development, potentially what that payoff is relative to a form of energy that already has a great deal of this energy density that I'm describing.
Yeah, so energy density really means how much, it's sort of a how much bang for the buck do you get from a given energy investment, and how much territory does it require? Because wind versus nuclear is a great example. You know, you look at a nuclear power plant that's relatively compact. It produces a lot of energy in a small area from a very dense, energy-dense fuel, uranium. To replace the kilowatt hours that you get out of a nuclear power plant with wind turbines, you know, first of all, you need about 3 or 4 times as much wind capacity as the nuclear power plant. So if your nuclear power plant is 1,000 megawatts, that's kind of the typical size of a nuclear reactor, you would need something like 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of wind turbines, because, as we've talked about earlier in the show, the wind doesn't blow all the time. On average, a wind turbine produces about a third or so of its nameplate capacity over the course of the year. So there's going to be parts of the day it's sitting idle. There may be days on end at different times of the year where it's sitting idle. And you'll drive by wind farms and you'll see turbines just sitting there and not spinning. At other times you go by and they're all spinning like crazy. So that's the nature of wind energy. Look at the footprint of that wind farm. You know, a wind farm, to produce the same energy as a nuclear power plant, you're not talking about a few acres. You're talking about square miles. And that's really the essence of energy density. Energy density is one of the reasons that we still burn gasoline in cars, because, you know, even compared to something like ethanol, a gallon of ethanol only takes you about 2/3 as far as a gallon of gasoline. Fossil fuels, you know, hydrocarbons like oil and its products, are incredibly energy dense. So it comes out of the ground in a form where it's carrying a lot of energy, and it's very convenient. I once did a little back-of-the-envelope comparison of refilling the gas tank in your car takes 2 or 3 minutes, and you put 20 gallons in or 15 gallons. To put the equivalent amount of electricity into a battery-powered vehicle in that amount of time, you would need voltages and current, amperages, comparable to the electric chair. And I'm not sure that you would be able to get Underwriters Laboratory to certify putting something like that out where the public can actually touch it and use it.
And where do you put the warning labels? Yeah, listen, we're up against a break, Jeff. Hang on. Roger wants to visit with you, and we have a couple lines open. And this conversation quite literally could go on all day, but we only have about another 15 or 20 minutes. So give us a call at 721-1290 if you'd like to get in on it. And no, I don't. 721-1290 is our number. John King's over there. Bob Seidenschwartz over here. I'm Peter Christen. Joining us on the phone, Jeff Stiles. Go ahead, John.
I had one big quick, this would be my last question, but it's a big picture question.
I doubt it. Go ahead, John.
My big picture question is this. You did a really good job of explaining the density issue when it comes to energy. Is there a simple way that you can explain the economic costs of the different types of energy? Like, how much does it cost to get a watt of wind energy versus solar versus nuclear versus coal versus, you know?
With or without subsidies?
Yeah, with or without, yeah.
So this is interesting because it's a lot harder to answer that question than it used to be because of the properties of these new technologies, okay? So, you know, it used to be that you talked about building a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant or a gas-fired power plant, and you could make comparisons that would hold true pretty much anywhere, right? So it's going to cost this much for coal, it's going to cost this much from natural gas, this much from nuclear. Now, when you're looking at the renewables, wind and solar in particular, it's not enough to talk about the technology. Now you have to talk about where, right? Because solar in one part of the world has a completely different cost profile than solar in a different part of the world, even though the equipment is the same, the cost of the equipment is the same, the installation costs are roughly the same, but the cost of the energy that comes out of a solar panel in Germany, for instance, is significantly higher than the cost of electricity coming out of a solar panel in Southern California, right? And that's because Germany, even though it's the place that has the most solar photovoltaic installations in the world, as far as I'm aware, has one of the poorest solar resources in the world. I mean, let's face it, Germany is not known as some place that people routinely go to catch the sun, right? A solar cell in Germany has about a 10% capacity factor. That means that over the course of the year, it's going to produce about 10% of the maximum electricity that you could get out of it if the sun was shining 24/7, right? 10%, 12%, something like that. You take that same solar cell and you install it in Arizona, and the number goes up dramatically. Now it's maybe 25%, 28%, something like that. And because you get a lot more energy out of it, the cost per unit of energy goes down significantly.
Okay.
So you have to make those comparisons as well. So there's no more rules of thumb that you can say, oh, well, wind versus gas, wind is always more competitive. It's going to matter where the wind is installed because not every place has the same wind resource.
What about renewables in general versus traditional? I mean, this is a huge question, right?
The cost of all the renewables are coming down, and they've come down significantly. Solar has come down the most. Solar is close to being competitive with fossil fuels in certain locations, right? But you still have all these other issues. So that's just looking at, I get a kilowatt hour out of this technology, I get a kilowatt hour out of that technology. But the problem is the technologies are still not comparable because I can take that gas-fired power plant and I can run it 85% of the year, maybe more. I can run it more or less 24/7. I can certainly run it when I want, where I want. That's not true with wind and solar. So you have to figure out how do you balance the grid when you've got a heavy reliance on things that are producing not when you tell them to produce, but to produce when the forces of nature tell them to produce. And you have to make up the difference with something else. That's what we're moving into. So what cost do you put on that? I mean, there have been estimates of, what does it cost the grid to balance those other things? Those costs go up the more of those wind and solar installations you have. So when there's a little, it doesn't cost very much. When it's 15 or 20% of the grid, the costs become significant.
Okay, let's get back to the phone. Roger, you're on Talk Back with Jeff Stiles. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. This is Roger. I was wondering and thinking back on this carbon dioxide question of having so much in the atmosphere, et cetera. I think I was taught, if I remember right, that trees absorb carbon dioxide and give off oxygen as a byproduct, whereas humans do just the opposite. How come we can't do a little bit more sponge work with trees?
Okay, thanks for the call.
That's a great question. And, if you look at the discussions that have been held at these big global climate meetings, like the one in Paris last year, what gets everybody's attention is the emissions that are coming out of fossil fuel power plants, that are coming out of cars and things like that. But there's also discussion about deforestation, about agricultural practices. One of the big questions around biofuel is that, things like ethanol, is when you produce biofuels from land that hasn't been tilled before, when you till that land for the first time, when you cut down the native crop that was there and you make a plantation to produce, whether it's whether it's corn, whether it's sugar cane, or some other energy crop, you've released a lot of carbon from the soil. You've released carbon from the native vegetation that was there. How do you make that up over time? So there's a lot that can be done trying to adjust agricultural practices, doing some replanting of forests.
Uh-oh.
Does that help?
Nope. Yeah, that just certainly does. Okay, let's move along. Bobby's up next. Hi, Bobby. You're on with Jeff. Go ahead.
Hi. So I had a lot of science when I was in college, and I majored in geology for a while. And the thing that you learn about the Earth is that it's in a constant state of change, including the climate. It never stays the same. But the last guy said about the deforestation, or what you said, you see that a lot of the liberals don't want third world countries having any power plants. Would it be better if they had a power plant than to deforest their whole area so that they could have fuel to cook their meals and such?
Okay,
what do you think about?
Tell you what, Bobby, I'm going to have him answer that after this 1 minute break. So thanks for your call. He'll get to that right after we take a 60-second timeout. It's our last one. We'll be right back.
Jeff?
Okay, we're back on Talk Back. Just a few minutes left in our program, and Jeff, Bobby just asked you a question about, some of the undeveloped countries. Probably better to have a power plant than to be burning all the wood for fuel.
You know, what it really comes down to is people's access to modern energy. You know, we don't think about it much in the U.S., but there's still hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people around the world who are relying on very basic forms of energy, including wood, including animal dung, and things like that for their basic energy needs. Replacing that with modern energy, even if it's a fossil fuel, giving somebody a propane stove instead of burning dung to heat their food can make a huge difference for indoor air pollution and other things that really have a direct bearing on people's health in the third world. The whole issue about deforestation versus the power plant, it's possible to look at the math on that and decide whether, which one makes the most sense. But if you're talking about improving people's lives day to day, you need to look at the energy that you're using as part of their daily life. And if you can improve that and make sure that they're not living in a smoke-filled home where they're suffering lung damage every day or every time they step out of their home, you're going to make a major improvement in their lives.
Okay, let's get another caller on. This is Dave. Dave, good morning. You're on with Jeff Stiles. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. About coal, I've read that in the 1970s there was like 700,000 people employed mining coal. Now there's like 55,000, and a lot of that has to do with automation, of course. But I'm curious to know, jumping over to hydrogen, I've heard the French are building a hydrogen plant. Do you have any knowledge of that? Is that really happening?
I don't know about that specific hydrogen plant, but the reality is that we use a lot of hydrogen already. Every refinery either has a hydrogen plant as part of it or has access to a third-party hydrogen plant on site. Because we use hydrogen in the process of making the fuels that we already use. I saw the other day that Nissan is introducing a new fuel cell car that will actually get its hydrogen from ethanol. So you put ethanol in the car's tank, and then on board the vehicle, it turns that ethanol into hydrogen. It's kind of an interesting idea because you don't have to tote the hydrogen around. Hydrogen is hard to store and move. But then you have to look at the efficiency of how the ethanol is produced and a bunch of other things. But, a lot of people are excited about shifting to hydrogen, but we always have to remember that hydrogen doesn't occur naturally on the Earth. It's always tied up in some kind of a chemical compound, whether it's part of water, whether it's part of natural gas. 98% of the hydrogen that's produced in the world is produced from natural gas because it's pretty easy to do that. And that's the basis for most of the fertilizer that's used in the world, producing ammonia-based fertilizer from natural gas going through hydrogen.
So, Jeff, we just have a couple of minutes.
3 minutes.
Speak to the audience and describe what, if you were talking to the governor, the senators, the president, in terms of this very complicated issue, what type of thoughts and advice would you like to share in terms of how we move forward?
To me, the most important thing is to make sure that we're looking at all of these choices that we have. And we have a lot of choices. We're blessed with choices. We have way more choices than we had 20 or 30 years ago. But we need to make sure that we look at these choices on a level playing field, that we're not approaching them in a way that we're trying to pick winners and losers because we have some innate like of this technology versus that technology, or we don't like the place where this other technology is produced. We need to look at these things on a level playing field and make sure that, what we're really promoting is innovation. And the best way to promote innovation is not necessarily the same as what we've been doing by subsidizing people installing a bunch of new technology.
All right.
Peter?
We have about 2.5 minutes left in the program. So we have any other Facebook comments there, John?
Well, let me do a quick load up. I was just checking on Brexit to see if the decision had come
that
down.
That won't come until early in the morning our time, apparently.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, we got to wait on that one.
Let's see here.
No,
we don't.
One thing that I would throw in is that, there's an awful lot of uncertainty. I mean, we've got tremendous new technologies, we've got a lot of opportunities, but there's a lot of uncertainty that goes with all of this. There's uncertainty about the policies that the government is going to come out with and whether it's going to continue to support one technology or another technology. There's uncertainty about what the adoption of these technologies is going to mean in terms of how we live. Will we be able to buy cars that can still drive 300 or 400 miles without having to recharge them overnight? So all of these things are happening, and they're happening at a time when there's a lot of other uncertainty as well. There's uncertainty geopolitically. There's uncertainty about the other technologies in our lives, things about, the Internet and cell phones. All of these things are changing rapidly. So we're living through a time of tremendous change.
So, Jeff, one of the ways
energy is a major contributor to that, but I think it's become a positive contributor instead of a negative contributor.
Okay, Jeff, hang on. Go ahead, Bob.
I just wanted to reduce some of this uncertainty. One of the things that I've identified is the consumer has a lot of power in terms of self-education and reducing how they use energy and what they do on a daily basis. Isn't that maybe one of the most efficient ways we can start?
I think people need to understand more about where the energy that they use comes from. Electricity doesn't just come from the wall. Gasoline doesn't just come from a dispenser in the front of a gas station. We need to understand where this stuff comes from and understand how realistic it is to swap one for another.
Okay, now, Jeff, I'm going to stop you right there because we're like 30 seconds left. How can we find out more about your work and so we can look it up and read it?
Right. So if you go and Google on Energy Outlook, that's my blog. You may need to put my name in, but probably not.
That's Geoff, right?
Geoffrey, Styles, Styles. Energy Outlook blog is where you can learn more about my views on all of these issues.
Fantastic. It has been a pleasure getting to know you, Jeff. We'd love to have you back again anytime, okay?
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
You take care. Thanks so much. All right. Tomorrow, of course, it's Friday, so we have the Fishing Show, and then it's an hour of open phones.
Open phone.
All right. So have a great day, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.